Now look, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one, because this one's been building quietly for weeks, and most people watching didn't realize how close it came to falling apart. It's Monday, July 13th, 2026, the Senate Appropriations Committee's Defense Subcommittee. Two chairs that matter enormously right now are empty. One belongs to Mitch McConnell, recovering and absent from the floor with no announced return date. The other belonged, until very recently, to Lindsey Graham, who died suddenly of a ruptured aorta, a shock to a Senate that doesn't get shocked easily anymore. On the surface, this looks like personnel news, the kind of story that runs for a day and fades. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about how fragile President Trump's single biggest financial ask of this Congress really is. Because most people watching didn't realize what actually hangs in the balance behind those two empty chairs: a defense budget request unlike anything this country has seen. $1.5 trillion. And right now, with the men who were supposed to help shepherd it through the Senate sideline, nobody in Washington can tell you with confidence whether it gets done. This touches whether the shipbuilders in your state keep their contracts, whether the missile defense system this administration is racing to build gets funded on schedule, and whether Congress still has the backbone to say no to a president of either party when the numbers don't add up. Now, there's a figure I want you to hold on to: $350 billion. That's the piece of this budget request that's caused all the trouble, and we'll come back to exactly why in a few minutes, because it's the key to understanding this entire fight. And there's a second thread, a warning two of the Senate's own defense appropriators gave in their own words, calling part of this strategy a terrible risk. Stay with me. We'll come back to that too, because it tells you something about how even the president's own party is starting to push back. To understand tonight, you've got to understand how we got here, because the chain of events matters. Go back to earlier this year. The Trump administration puts in a defense budget request that would push total Pentagon spending past $1.4 trillion, an 18% jump in acquisition spending alone over the year before. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defends it in front of the House Armed Services Committee in April, framing it as overdue modernization after years of underinvestment. But here's where it gets complicated. Rather than asking Congress to fund all of that through the normal appropriations process, the way defense spending has traditionally worked, through committee hearings, negotiation, and yes, compromise with Democrats, the White House split the request in two: $1.15 trillion through the regular National Defense Authorization Act, and $350 billion more through budget reconciliation, the special procedure that lets the majority party pass spending with a simple majority, sidestepping the 60 votes normally needed in the Senate. This wasn't a new trick. Republicans had already used reconciliation once this year to add $150 billion to defense inside what the White House calls the One Big Beautiful Bill. They used it again for a second package funding immigration enforcement. Now Trump wanted a third bite, this time explicitly for the Pentagon. And layered on top of all that, the unresolved cost of American military operations against Iran and in Venezuela, what Hegseth has called filling the hole in the budget. By early summer, Pentagon officials put the Iran operation's cost at roughly $29 billion and climbing, with some senators suspecting the real total, once it's finally disclosed, will run well past $200 billion. That's the echo running under this entire fight, a war whose full price tag still hasn't been made public, sitting on top of an already historic budget ask. You know, every so often you get a moment that tells you more about how Washington actually operates than 100 campaign ads ever could. And watching the president personally lobby individual House Republicans at the Pentagon in back-to-back meetings over a spending bill that hadn't even been formally submitted yet, that's one of those moments. Trump called on Congress directly in a Wednesday night statement to approve the full $350 billion through reconciliation immediately. Hegseth followed up in person twice in 1 week, meeting with Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington and Republican Study Committee Chair August Pfluger to press the case. That kind of full court press aimed at your own party's rank and file usually means the votes aren't nearly as certain as the public rhetoric suggests. Let me be precise here, because the details matter more than anybody's spin. The base defense bill working through Congress totals $1.072 trillion, an increase of $234 billion over the prior year's enacted level. Appropriations Committee ranking member Rosa DeLauro called it the largest defense budget in American history and noted it doesn't even include the additional cost of the Iran operation. On the reconciliation side, the $350 billion in question is earmarked for shipbuilding, missile production, and the administration's Golden Dome missile defense shield, priorities Pentagon officials say are urgent, given that Russia is spending roughly $200 billion a year on its military and China somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. But the votes aren't there. Senate Appropriations Committee Chair Susan Collins of Maine told reporters plainly that she doesn't believe a third reconciliation bill can pass. Mitch McConnell, chairing the Defense Subcommittee, said at a hearing on the Air Force budget that it's safe to conclude there won't be another reconciliation bill at all. Senate Majority Leader John Thune has acknowledged the math is brutal. Republicans just finished an 18-hour overnight vote marathon to pass a $70 billion immigration package. And vulnerable incumbents heading into the midterms have little appetite for another round of politically damaging votes before November. Meanwhile, separate from all of this political theater, the Pentagon quietly told Congress in late June it's reprogramming $4.3 billion in existing funds, shifting money away from shipbuilding delays and Army training accounts toward what officials called higher priority personnel and operational costs tied to emergent mobilization requirements. That's not new money. That's the Pentagon rearranging what it already has, because the new money hasn't arrived. A few more figures, because this is where the homework really shows. Under that reprogramming request, the Air Force alone absorbed $1.5 billion in cuts, including nearly $200 million pulled straight from the F-35 program, a jet that, according to Government Accountability Office testimony this year, still only achieves full mission capability roughly 25% of the time, despite being the most expensive acquisition program in American history. The Army shifted $1.3 billion away from National Guard training and administrative accounts. The Navy moved another $1.4 billion, including funds tied to delayed shipbuilding contracts. None of this is scandal exactly. It's the ordinary machinery of a department managing shortfalls while it waits on Congress. But it's also a preview of what happens more broadly if the big reconciliation number never materializes. A Pentagon perpetually robbing Peter to pay Paul. So let me put my analyst hat on for a minute, because the strategy and the risk in it is worth examining closely. Using reconciliation for defense spending was on paper a clever move. It let Republicans pass $150 billion in extra military funding last year with 0 Democratic votes needed and 0 Democratic amendments attached. From the administration's point of view, why not run that play a third time? But here's the part that should give you pause, whichever side of the aisle you're on. Reconciliation was designed as a narrow, once-a-year budget tool, not a substitute for the normal, deliberate process of funding the military. Appropriators, including Republicans like Collins and McConnell, are warning that leaning on it for the bulk of defense spending creates real instability, because a future Congress with a different majority could simply refuse to renew that funding stream, leaving the Pentagon with a permanent hole where $150 or $350 billion used to be. So who actually benefits from pushing defense funding through this narrower, more fragile channel instead of the traditional bipartisan process? Ask yourself that. In the short term, it's whoever controls the reconciliation process right now, that's Trump and congressional Republicans, who get to write the check without needing a single Democratic signature. But in the long run, it may not benefit anyone, including the Pentagon itself, if it means military modernization plans get built on a foundation that could shift with the next election. And this is where the empty chairs I open with matter enormously. Without McConnell present, the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee sits at a 14-14 tie between the parties, meaning a regular defense spending bill likely can't even clear the panel and reach the floor right now. Graham's sudden death removed another key link between the White House and Senate Republicans on these exact negotiations. A Cato Institute defense analyst put it bluntly in recent reporting: Republicans have essentially run out of runway on the reconciliation strategy, and the administration's own approach to requesting the funding in the first place bears real responsibility for the bind Congress now finds itself in. There's a timing squeeze here, too, that deserves attention. Congress has fewer than 30 scheduled working days left before the midterm elections, and an August recess is already carved out of that calendar. Senate leadership could, in theory, cancel that recess and keep members in Washington working through the summer, a move one analyst described as a genuine show of leadership if Republicans were willing to make it. Whether they will remains an open question, and it tells you something about how much political appetite actually exists for pushing this fight through on the accelerated timeline the White House wants. Now, I want to be fair here, because this isn't about one party. Let's be honest about the criticism aimed at Trump's own side first. Using a budget procedure meant for narrow fiscal adjustments to fund the largest military budget in American history is, by the admission of Trump's own Senate allies, bad practice. It cuts out the normal oversight process, the hearings, the line-by-line scrutiny, the horse trading that, frustrating as it is, has historically kept military spending at least somewhat accountable to elected representatives outside the majority party. And let me say something that Democrats' usual coalition won't want to hear either. Reflexively opposing every dollar of this budget without distinguishing between genuinely wasteful items and legitimate modernization needs isn't a serious position either. Munition stockpiles genuinely are low after years of supplying allies abroad. Shipbuilding capacity genuinely has atrophied. Even Democratic aligned defense analysts, writing at places like Brookings, have acknowledged that most of what's in this request isn't reckless on its face. The problem is the process being used to fund it and the lack of year-by-year congressional control that comes with it, not the underlying dollar figure alone. The plain truth is this fight isn't really Republicans versus Democrats. It's Congress's power of the purse versus a White House that would rather not have to negotiate for it every single year. I see three roads from here, and I want to be honest about all of them. Scenario A, the best case, at least for anyone who cares about how our government actually functions. The third reconciliation bill quietly dies, as McConnell and Collins predict. Defense funding gets worked out the old-fashioned way through the regular appropriations process, forcing genuine negotiation, genuine oversight, and, however messy, a defense budget that both parties had some hand in shaping. It's slower, it's less dramatic, but it's how this is supposed to work. Scenario B, the muddle and probably the most likely outcome. No sweeping reconciliation bill, but also no full collapse. A smaller supplemental request eventually gets negotiated, patched together with reprogramming maneuvers like the one we just talked about, filling gaps piecemeal rather than through one clean vote. The Pentagon makes do, but with less certainty about long-term programs like the Golden Dome Shield. Scenario C, the one that keeps me up at night. The vacancy at the top of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, combined with a fractured GOP conference heading into a bruising midterm season, leads to genuine paralysis, a defense funding bill that can't clear committee, a supplemental that never gets requested formally, and a Pentagon left improvising through reprogramming and continuing resolutions for the rest of the fiscal year, right as tensions with adversaries who are not standing still keep climbing. My honest assessment, the sheer political cost of appearing weak on defense makes total paralysis unlikely. Somebody eventually finds a way to get money to the Pentagon. But whether that money comes with real congressional oversight attached or gets rushed through in a way that sets a troubling precedent for how future presidents fund wars and weapons systems alike, that's genuinely still up in the air. So let's pay off what we opened with tonight. That $350 billion figure I asked you to hold on to. Now you can see exactly why it became the fault line of this entire fight, and why two Republican senators felt compelled to call reliance on it a terrible risk, in their own words, to their own president's budget strategy. And those two empty chairs on the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, that's not a footnote. That may be the single biggest variable in whether any of this gets resolved before the fiscal year runs out. Here's the plain truth, folks. However you feel about the size of the defense budget, the process by which it gets approved matters just as much as the number itself. A Congress that stops asking hard questions about how military money gets spent isn't doing its job, no matter which party happens to be in the majority when it happens. I've seen this country do hard things before, fund wars we didn't want to fight, rebuild militaries that had been allowed to atrophy, and still manage, eventually, to hold our elected officials accountable for how the money got spent. I believe we can do that again here, but only if we keep watching closely past the headline number into the fine print of how it actually gets appropriated. Stay engaged on this one. Call your senators, whichever party they belong to, and ask them a simple question. Are you funding the military through the process built for genuine oversight or through the one built to avoid it? That's not a partisan question. It's a constitutional one. I've sat with enough of these budget fights over the years to tell you they rarely resolve the way anyone predicts in July. New names step into empty chairs. New crises reorder the priority list. What doesn't change is the basic principle at stake, that the power to spend on behalf of this nation's defense belongs to the people's representatives, deliberating in the open, not to any one office holding the pen. Keep your eye on this one through the fall. It'll tell you as much about the health of this Congress as it does about the size of our military. That's what I'm asking you to think about tonight. God bless, and take care of each other.